Hello, everyone. Welcome to IP Tech Lab. So, in this series, we are going to dive deep into Python programming, not just by memorizing code, but by truly understanding the concepts behind it. So, whether you are starting from scratch or looking to strengthen your skills, this series is designed to give you the confidence to master Python and its applications. So, this tutorial is perfect for beginners. And no matter if you come from a tech background or not, we will start from the basics and we will go through step by step through Python programming, right? So make sure to check out my Python tutorials for beginners playlist for a comprehensive journey through the language. So you can also find specific topics you are interested in, all organized in one place in my playlist, and I will also post a link for my playlist in the video description as well. So, but before we start coding in Python, so let's take a look at how Python fits into the world of web applications. So, for that, we will walk through a real world scenario. So, the scenario is this that I have here. These are some banking websites. So, these I took as an example to show you, but we can take any application or any website. It doesn't necessarily have to be a banking website, but the scenario that we are going to discuss here is when a user tries to log into any website by entering his username and password and clicking on the login button, or you can say the sign in button, right? So this you can see this is a Bank of America website here, and this is a Chase Bank website. So let's see. So in this video, we are going to be learning front end versus back end and how web applications work behind the scenes. So internally, what happens like after a user enters his username here and password here, and after a user clicks on the login button, so what will happen in the back end? Internally, what will happen? So that part we will discuss here, and we will also discuss the role of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So, for those who don't know any of these things, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we are just going to learn what they are and what they do, what their role is in a web application. Also, we will see how Python fits in all this scenario, right? So what Python does on the back end to process the requests and handle server side logic. So if you don't know any of this, don't worry because we are going to cover everything from scratch. And also we are going to see what is SQL and how Python uses SQL to connect to the database and what is a database. We will see everything. So, by the end of the video, I hope we will have a very clear understanding of how these technologies work together, right? So now let's say this is our scenario. You can take any website, it hardly matters. Uh, this is a Chase Bank website, right? Okay, now let's say, let me move to my notes over here. Okay, so here we have something called front end. So what is the front end? So let's see, the front end is the user interface that the end user interacts with. Now, before we learn what front end, we need to know what the end user is. So when we say the end user, it's the user who is trying to log into a web application. When we say web application, here specifically, we are just referring to these websites. It can be any website, it can be chase.com, it can be bankofamerica.com, or you can take any other website where you are trying to log in. But for this example, we took these websites. So, and you can consider these websites as web applications. So, who is the end user here? End user is somebody who is trying to enter his username and password here and trying to log into his account on these banking websites, right? So that's the end user. Now let's see what's next. So Now you know what the end user is. Now we need to understand that what is the user interface, right? So user interface, if you see here, if you come and see here that this is the chase.com website, and here you can see three categories on top: personal, business, commercial, and then all these navigation menus are there, the checkings, savings, credit cards, home loans, and all these things. And also here, this whole thing is a login form. This is called a login form here on the right, where you can put your username, password, and you can click on the sign in button, right? And then other than that, you can see some of the texts over here. These are the texts, and it can also have some images. It can have the logos. So these are all the things that you normally see on any website, right? So basically, whatever we are seeing over here, whatever the user is seeing over here on the website, this is called the user interface. Okay. So this is the user interface, and this user interface is a part of the front end, right? And this is what front end is. The front end is the user interface that the end user interacts with. So I hope you are clear what the front end is, and then what does the front end has? So the front end is actually typically built with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And there can be some frameworks, JavaScript frameworks these days, which are used like React.js or Vue.js to make the interface more dynamic and interactive, right? So for now, you don't have to worry about React.js or Vue.js. Main thing we are going to understand here is these three things: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML. HTML is actually a hypertext markup language. Now, what does HTML do? It defines the structure of the web page. So on this page, you can see this login page, right? This is, we can call it as a login page for Chase Bank. And whatever you see here, all these navigation menus you see here, right? And this login form and text and everything, all you see here, this is defined by HTML, right? HTML is a hypertext markup language, and these things are defined by HTML. For example, headings, the paragraphs, the navigation menus, images, the login form, which we just saw, all these things are defined by HTML. So basically, the basic structure of the web page. So, what is CSS now? CSS is actually cascading style sheets. Now, cascading style sheets are used to style and format the content which is defined by HTML. So how can it style and format the content? The CSS will add colors, fonts, and layouts to the HTML, right? So these are the things which can be added by CSS on top of the HTML. So I hope you are clear that what CSS is used for. Basically, CSS controls the appearance of the web page, such as colors, the background colors, the fonts, the layouts, and also the positioning of the elements, right? So positioning of the elements means like where this heading will go on a website, like where this is supposed to be displayed. This is a link for open an account. So where on this web page, where this link for open an account should be displayed, this is all done by CSS. And also these background colors and font size, font colors, different font colors on a website, right? All this styling part is done by CSS. All right. So now we know what is HTML and what is CSS and what they do. Now, just to show you this, I have some HTML code over here. Now, since we are all beginners, which I believe, so we don't need to remember any of this thing over here. All this code, we don't need to remember it at all, because this is something which I just wanted to show you, but we are here to learn Python. JavaScript is the next thing. So, what is JavaScript? So, JavaScript is something that adds interactivity to the page. For example, handling form submissions, validations. Okay. So now we will come to this part in a minute because I have to tell you what it means by adding interactivity to the page. We will talk about it in just a while. And React.js is just a JavaScript library which is used for building user interfaces in a dynamic way. So as I told you, you don't have to worry about React.js right now. So let's move forward here. And then this is an example of the JavaScript code. Again, you don't need to worry about it. Um, but I will tell you for sure what JavaScript does on a web page. Now, let's see the scenario here that what happens when the user clicks the login button, right? This is what we need to understand very clearly. Now, let's see here I have this web page. Now, let's say any user that came in, they put their username and they put some of their password, right? And they try to click login, or you can say sign in button. So, what will happen after you click login or sign in button? What will happen after that? So, here, let me go back to my notes here. Okay. So, first thing is the user enters the credentials. Credentials is the same. The credentials is the user information, whatever the user is entering into a website. So in our scenario that we are discussing, the user is going to enter their username and their password. So the username and password are the credentials over here. And you can see something here that which says client side. Client side means, let me show you another example here. Give me a second. So let me open this up. So this is a diagram. You should be able to see it now. Okay. Okay. So on the left hand side, you can say that this is the user. User can be anywhere in the world, just sitting in front of a laptop or a mobile phone or from wherever he is accessing the information. Now, obviously, if we assume that a user has a Windows laptop and he opens up a website, then he might be using any browser, which might be a Chrome browser, or if he's using a MacBook, then it might be a Safari, right? Or he might be using Microsoft Edge. So it can be any browser. Now the thing is, we already know what is front end, right? The front end over here, we already know. And we know that the user is entering his username and password. And then we already saw the login form. The login form had a username, a password, and the login button. Or you can say sign in button. It doesn't matter, whichever it is. Now, after that, we know what HTML is and what CSS is. Now, I have to tell you what JavaScript does. So, what JavaScript will do here for the UI, like you can see this UI. And here, the next thing you can see here is the client browser. It can be either Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Microsoft Edge, or any other browser, right? So basically, when what we are seeing here, everything is happening on the browser here, right? That's why we are mentioning it as a browser. And basically, when we say client means the browser, right? Over here, the client is referred to as the browser. Over here, the client is referred to as the browser. Now, what JavaScript does here is JavaScript will make sure that your fields are not empty. So what it means, let's see here. Now, let's say this is Bank of America website, let's say. Now, this is user ID and password. So what will happen if I don't enter any user ID and if I don't enter any password here? If I am the user and I don't enter any user ID and don't enter any password, and I right away I go and click login over here, what's going to happen? Immediately we are going to get some error, right? So it says we can't process your request and please enter all the required information to proceed. So basically this is happening because of JavaScript, right? So this is one of the validations that JavaScript performs on a web application, which ensures that if the user is clicking the login button with empty fields means this username and password fields. These are also called as fields. So if these fields are empty and if a user is trying to click login over here, then the JavaScript is automatically giving us this error here. Now let's go back to this picture here, this diagram. So I hope you know like the first roles that JavaScript plays is that it ensures that fields are not empty. And if the fields are empty, then we get error. So the user, being a user, we are able to see this error over here because of JavaScript, right? So just remember that. And let's see what's next. So it also validates email or phone format. For example, right now the fields are only user ID or password. But let's say if there was a field for email ID, and let's assume that this field was for email ID. And then let's say if you just use something like this, so JavaScript will automatically give you error on this because this is not a valid format for the email ID, right? Usually the email ID format is like something, some text in front and then at gmail.com or at yahoo.com, right? Or something. So this is actually a valid uh, email ID format. But if this field was a user, if this field was email ID field instead of the user ID field, and if you put this as your email, it won't work. So JavaScript also makes sure that such fields, the employee is entering a genuine data, right? So same goes with the password. Like sometimes these days they ask you, some of the websites they ask you that they have a certain criteria for the password, right? So for example, they say you can use some letters and you have to use some numbers and you have to use some capital case letters, and also you have to use one of the symbols can be at, hash, or question mark, or anything, right? So these are all, some for some websites these are all mandatory things that you have to use to create a password. If you miss any of this, like if you are not using any symbol here, so particular website might give you an error, and because you are not following the criteria for the password, right? So this is what JavaScript ensures on a website. And also, let's say the next thing is prevent excessive login attempts. So what else is JavaScript doing here? It is preventing excessive login attempts by from the user. So what it means is like if you, let's say you remember your username, right? Your username is Tom123, right? But let's say you forgot your password. Now, first time you put your password and you hit login, right? You give it a try, but if it is not a valid password for you, then it will give us an error, right? Okay, so first time you got the error. Next time again, the second time, you put your same username and you try a different password, right? You try a different password and hit login. Second time again, you did not put the correct password. You again you will get an error. Now let's say third time again you put your username and you try a different third password. Now unfortunately, if your third password is also an incorrect password, and if you try to hit the login button, then you will get maybe an error message that your account has been logged or it has been blocked. right? You will get that kind of message because based on whatever rules have been decided by that website. So this JavaScript will block you because it will give you an error because it will prevent excessive login attempts, right? So this is for security reasons as well because there are certain login attempts allowed only. It can be 3 login attempts or it can be 4 login attempts, right? But this is what is controlled by JavaScript here. And then the last thing is the hash password before sending optional. This hash password we are going to discuss further, right? So basically now we know what JavaScript does on the UI part. On the UI part means these are the things that are still just happening on the UI, on the client, or you can say the browser itself. But once JavaScript has ensured that everything is good, like you entered a certain user ID and you entered a certain password, JavaScript has made sure that these fields are not empty and all the criterias are met for both of these fields. And then when you click login, then the JavaScript part is done because JavaScript has verified over here everything. Now, when you hit the login button, what will happen is over here, if you go, so when you hit the login button, then there will be a request that will be sent from the client, which will be your browser. The request browser will send the request to the backend server. So next you can see over here is the backend server, right? So we are going to go back to our notes to understand what the server means. Okay, so we are back here. Now, till now, we are familiar with the client side. Basically, client side means the browser side, the front end, and the UI part. We have learned HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now we have to go back to learn the back end side now. Now, so what is the request? The request that we just talked about is that once JavaScript has done its part, then it will send a request to the backend, which is the server side. So, what is a request? A request is just a simple message which is sent by the client. What is the client? It's the user's browser. And the browser will send the request to who? It will send the request to the server. Okay. Now, this request is just a simple message, and this message contains the username and password which is entered by the user on the website for logging, right? So the client sends this request. The client means the browser. The browser sends this request to tell the server that please verify these credentials, right? So I hope you understand why this request has been sent from the browser to the server. Because let's say tomorrow, if there is nothing, if there is no server and if there is no server side, then if you consider this picture here, like let's say there is no backend server, there is no database, there is nothing. So what will happen is like when a user will input his details and it will hit the login button and all these things are working, the JavaScript is working. But when you hit the login button, then who will decide that is whether it is a valid user, whether the username is correct, whether your password is correct, and who will decide whether the user should be allowed to log into the website or web application, or he should be denied the access to the web application. So all these things are decided on the server, but these things, this logic, business logic, is handled by the backend programming languages. So which backend programming languages? One of those backend programming languages is Python, right? So Python handles this business logic where um, it will decide that whether it will validate, it will authenticate the user. Authenticating the user means it will take the credentials from the user, the username and password, and it will verify from the database that whether it is a valid user or whether that particular user has that username, the same username in the database or not, whether his password is correct or not. Once both of the things are correct, then Python will take the help of the server to send a response back to the client. But we are going too forward right now, so let's go step by step here. And let me go back to my notes here. So now we understand at least what the request is and who sends the request to who. The browser sends the request to the server, and it will ask, like kind of ask on the server that please verify these credentials. This is just to explain you that why the request is sent from the browser to the server. Now let's move forward. Now, what is a server? So server is actually a physical computer or a system which is designed to provide resources, services, or data to other computers. And which are the other computers? It's the clients over the network. So for a server, it can be multiple clients over the network. Clients means again the clients we are referring to the browsers. So a server is one central system which is running somewhere on a remote platform. It can be a server can be physically present in one of the data centers of the big companies. So like these big companies, they might have their own data centers where they have the servers, right? So for a user who is sitting at his home or office or outside or wherever, a user from anywhere in the world, when they are using their browser to open any web application and they are trying to log in to, let's say, to their banking website or Facebook or Gmail account or anywhere, the request from the browser goes directly to the server. The server is there, it might be there in one of the data centers of the big companies, or the company might be using some cloud hosting platforms like Amazon Web Services, the Google Cloud Platform, or Microsoft Azure, right? So either the servers can be hosted in the data centers, or the servers can be on the cloud platforms. So I hope you understand what the server is. It is just a computer or a system which is designed to provide resources, services, or data to other computers. Now, how it will provide? So the server is now in the context of the web applications, the server is where the backend code and the database reside. So the basically the backend code means whatever code that you have written in your Python programming language, or it can be any other backend programming languages like Node.js, or there are many other backend programming languages. Whatever code you write over there, that will be there on the server. And then also the database will be there on the server. Now the database can be on the same server, or it can be on a different server too. But uh, the server will provide the resources. What resources we are talking about here? So then to learn the resources, come over here. Now the server is responsible. Let's see the role of the server, right? So the server's role is to accept the request which has been sent by the client. Client means the browser again. So the when browser sends the request to the server, it's gonna be the server's responsibility to receive that request, right? So, and also the resources that we are talking that the server provides is like CPU, memory. Memory management is done by the server, the network access. The server will make sure that 24/7 there should be a network connectivity between the client and the server side. So basically, between the browser and the server side, it has to be 100% connectivity at all times. So all these resources and the memory management, the space and everything, this all management is done by the server. But what server cannot do, like server itself does not process the logic behind the request. It will accept the request from the browser, but the server cannot make decisions on which response to send back for that particular request. That's why on the server side we have some programming languages which like Python or Node.js or many other programming languages, which in which we have written the code for the backend, basically the business logic, which we were talking about earlier, like whether the Python will make sure that the user name is correct and the password is correct, and only if both of those things are correct, only then it will allow you to log in to your account on that particular website. Otherwise, it will deny. So this decision making is done by Python, but server is something which provides all the resources and the environment for all these things to happen, right? So I believe we have talked a lot about what the server is. Now, what is the backend? The backend is the part of the web application that runs on the server and handles tasks such as processing data, right? Which data? The same data that the user entered on the UI, like username and password, and validating that those credentials, interacting with the database. We will talk about database in a minute, what a database is and why it is required. We'll talk about that. For example, checking if the credentials match. Credentials match means we will talk about that. Business logic, again, it's the same thing we just spoke about. Now, why do we need Python or Node.js? We talked a little bit about this already, that the server cannot handle the business logic. Server can only provide the resources, it can maintain the environment, it can accept the request from the client side, but what to do with that request, server cannot make those decisions. That's why this backend code, or you can say Python or Node.js, these are two different things. Node.js is a different backend programming language, and Python is a different backend programming language. And by the use of these programming languages, we can handle the logic behind the scenes, right? So which we are going to see in a minute. So the server does itself doesn't know how to process any business logic, how to verify the credentials. How to verify the credentials means how to verify whether the username is correct for the user and the password is correct for the user. This server cannot do that. And how to interact with the database on its own. The server cannot do that. We need something to do all this, which will be a backend programming language. And one of those programming languages is Python. So I hope you got the overall overview of why Python is needed and what Python can do. But in detail, we are going to learn a little bit more, right? So Python or any other backend language like Node.js is required to define the logic that drives the application, right? Without Python or similar languages, the server would just be an empty resource provider and not capable of performing the tasks necessary for user authentication, user verification, right? And interaction with the data. Okay. So now let's first learn what is a database and what is it and why do we need it. Now, a database is something that stores all the critical data for an application. So, for example, in this case, where we are trying to log in to any bank website, right? It can be any bank, right? In this case, what could be the things that are might be stored in a database, right? So those things are maybe the user credentials. So, of course, the user credentials because the username and passwords are stored in a database. But not only that, so inside the database, everything like for a particular user, like let's say a bank might have thousands or hundred of thousands or millions of customers, right? For all those customers are users for Bank of America, or you can say Chase.com, because all those people are their customers. Now, when and they all those users have their individual data. They have their individual username and password to log in into the website. They have their account data, right? Account type, whether it is a checking account or a savings account. All those users have their different balances for their accounts, and even they have their transaction history. So, why do we need a database? Basically, the server needs the database to store all this data, right? All this data is stored in the company's database, right? So, your username is stored there, your password, all this data is stored there. And this is why the database is required to store all this data. And the other thing is to retrieve the data, to access the data. So, why do we need to access that data once it is stored in the database? For verification purposes. Like how Python will make sure that the data that the user is entering for logging in into the website, how will the Python make sure that that data is authentic? So basically, if we go back here and if you enter your user ID and password, and if you hit login button, and then the request will go from the browser to the server, and on the server there will be Python programming language. So for Python programming language to make sure that this data which is entered by the user here is valid data, so for that to ensure that Python will connect to the database, because these things for a particular user are stored in the database. Now, how Python will do that, we will see in a minute, right? So let's go back to our notes here. So let's say when a login request comes in, the backend will query the database. Query the database means it will ask a question to the database, or you can understand easy in this way, to verify if the username and password match the stored data. What it means is like the data which the user has entered physically on the banking website, like we just saw Tom123, right? Tom123 and his password. Whether this data Does this data match the data which is stored in the database or not? If this data matches the data which is stored in the database, then the user will be allowed to log in. Otherwise, we might get an error message, right? So this is why we need a database. And I hope you understand what the database is. And I hope you understand what the server is as well. Now let's go next is database authentication behind the scenes. So we already spoke about this, that server does not perform the actual database operations. It uses the backend code Python to query the database. Now Python code. Now Python will send a query to the database to check if the username exists. It fetches the stored password, which is usually hashed. Now let's talk about something called password hash over here. So I have this Excel sheet over here. Basically, I made it just to show you how the data is stored in a database, right? So inside a database, there are some databases where the data is stored in the form of tables. So in each table, what do you have? You have some different columns, right? And you have some rows, right? These are the rows. So this is how there are some databases in which the data is stored in this format. Now, as you can see here, these are multiple users, and these they might have their different usernames, and also they might have their different passwords, right? Now, the thing is the data stored exactly as this in the database, right? So it might not be stored exactly as the same as you can see here. But if you on the right hand side, if you see here the data stored in database here, and this might be how it might be stored in the database, the data. So these are different users. So it can be the username can be like different uh, names it can have. But the thing here is the password. So the password is not stored, whatever actual password is, it is for the user. Like let's say this is a user Tom123, and his real password to log into a website is ABC1234. But inside the database, this password will not be stored exactly as the same ABC1234. The reason behind that is, for example, tomorrow if a hacker comes up, and let's say a hacker accidentally gets access to the database, to the company's database. If a hacker gets access to a company's database, then what will happen? He will have access to all the users, their usernames, and their passwords, right? So all the data will be exposed, and this is a high security issue, right? Because all your personal data, basically, it will be exposed to the hacker, and it will be a data breach. But in order to prevent this, what happens is when a database stores a password, right? This password for individual user, for all the users, all their passwords are converted into something called a password hash. So how it is converted into a password hash, you don't need to worry about that. The main thing you have to understand here is that their actual password is not stored the same inside the database. So you see these kind of numbers here. This is just an example to show you how their password might be stored inside the database. But this is actually the encrypted form of the actual password, right? So this is what happens like when if a hacker might go to the database now. Now, if a hacker gets access to the database, he will see some usernames, but their passwords will not be the actual passwords. So, since these will not be the actual passwords which the hacker might have access to, so the hacker will not be able to steal any of your data because he will not be able to log in to the web application, right? Because this data is encrypted. And this conversion that I told you from actual password to the password hash, it is a one-way conversion, right? This means that even if I give you this password hash, you will not be able to find out what my actual password was because it is a one-way conversion. Only password hash can be generated from your actual password, but the other way it cannot happen. You cannot generate the actual password from your password hash. It can never happen. So this is the best way. This is the reason why passwords are stored as password hash inside the database. So I hope you understood this part. Now let's go forward in our notes. Now, other thing is, you understand this point. It fetches the stored password. So we are going to see this with the as an example of a Python code. So let's go over there. Just hold on to these 4 points for now. And how password validation is done. This we already talked about. Uh, how the server decides what response to send back. So, okay, the next point is how the server decides what response to send back. This we will come back in a minute. But before that, I have to show you something here. I might have a Python code here. Okay. So now what is going to happen is Python. This is an example of a Python code. So don't worry about what is Python Flask. Don't worry about this thing here in the notes. Now, first thing what will happen is the Python what will do, it will do is first thing is that it will get the credentials from the request, right? From which request? It is this is the same request that was sent by the client, and the client was the browser. So this is the same request that was sent by the browser to the server. Now the server has received the request, and Python is something which is there on the server of on the server side, right? So Python will get this request from the server. So when we talked about what a request is, it is just a message, right? And that message has username and password. So this means that these credentials which the user entered on the web page, the Python will get these usernames and passwords from that request. Now, next thing what it will do is it will connect to the database. So Python will try to connect to the database. Now, for Python to connect to the database and for Python to do any kind of communication with the database, there is something Python will need. So Python might need a SQL, which is called a structured query language. It is also called a structured query language. Don't worry about what this is, SQL is, and how it works. We don't need to worry about it right now and how it actually works with the code. Don't need to worry about this. But the only thing you need to understand is that Python, or there is SQL is a medium between Python and database. So Python needs SQL to communicate to the database. Anything that Python needs to do with the database, whether to get any information from the database, or whether to update any information on the database, or whether to delete any user information from the database. Python can do it, but with the use of SQL. Just remember it in this way, right? And this is all you need to know right now about SQL, nothing more. Now let's go back here. Okay. So we saw that Python got the credentials from the request, and Python will connect to the database. And don't worry about this code. Even I am not even talking about what this code means and everything. But I am just going to go through these comments here, and these basic English lines that are mentioned over here as comments. I'm just trying to explain you those things. So after connecting to the database, it will query to check if the username exists. Query means, again, the same thing. You can understand it in this way that it will ask a question to the database that whether this username exists or not. For example, the example that we took here. So Tom123, and after he entered his password, and when he hit the login button, what will happen? The request will go from the browser to the server, and from the server, the Python will take this request. So when Python get these credentials, the username and password from here, then it will connect to the database. Then after connecting to the database, Python will query the database. Then it will ask a question to the database with the help of SQL, that whether this username Tom123, whether this username exists in the database or not. Now, okay, so this is what it is till now. Now, after that, let's say Python will get a response from the database, right? So let's say, for example, uh, if the Python gets a response from the database that yes, Tom123 is a valid user, and that this user Tom123 exists in the database, then what will happen? Then Python will compare the entered password with the stored hash, right? So now let's understand it over here. Now Python has connected to the database, right? And it has asked a query to the database that whether the user Tom123 is that valid or invalid, right? This is the question which was asked by Python to the database. Now, let's say the database responded back to the Python, and then database said that, okay, yes, it is a valid username. Now, username has been verified. Once username has been verified, then what Python will do? Then Python will take the password entered by the user, which will be this password entered by the user. Now, let's say Tom123 entered the password as ABC1234, right? So this is the actual password for Tom, right? Now Python will again send a query. First, Python what will do is Python will convert this password to password hash, and it can be same those numbers, right? The password hash. After Python converts this password to password hash, then Python will compare this password hash to the password hash which is stored in the database, right? As we saw here, whatever user entered password is, it will convert it to the password hash. Then it will compare that password hash which is stored in the database. So let's see here in our notes over here. So over here. So as you can see here, it will compare the entered password with the stored hash in the database. Now, after that, once after it is compared, if the user entered password, if the password entered by Tom123 is the same as the password which is stored in the database, then what will happen? Then it will say login successful, right? Then this response will be created, which will be login successful. But if that password did not match, then what will happen? If the password did not match, then it will say an error message, which will be invalid password, right? And let's say over here, when Python did a query to the database to check whether the username exists or not. Now let's also assume that the database said, no, this is not a valid username. The username itself is not valid. Then Python will not even move forward, and Python will not even check for any password or anything. Because if the username itself is wrong, then Python does not have to worry about whether the password is correct or wrong password. Because then Python can skip all these things, and then it can straight away come over here, and then it will right away give you an error that it is an invalid username, right? So don't worry about how this code is written and what is happening inside the code. But generally, what are the steps involved, what Python will do, and how Python will do these things? So it was, I felt it was important to make you understand about all these things. So I hope you have understood how Python connects to the database and how database responds back to Python and how these things are working together in sync, right? So now after all this has happened, now if the response, the message, if the response message, if it is a success response, for example, if the login credentials are valid. So after Python has confirmed from the database and Python has performed the business logic and everything, and once Python find out that the login credentials that the user has entered, all those are valid, then the server might send back a success message. So because when the client, the browser sends a request to the server, and the server, the Python programming language performs all the business logic and everything, then it's the server's responsibility to send back a response as well, to back to the client or back to the browser. So based on whatever decisions have been made by Python here, based on that, a success response will be sent back by the server back to the browser. So if the login credentials are valid, then it will send a success message. And if the credentials are invalid, then it will send an error message. The error message can be anything. If the user name does not exist in the database, then the error message can be invalid username. Or if the user username exists in the database, but the entered password is wrong, then it can say the error message where it can say invalid password, right? So these are the things that might happen, and then this is how the server will send a response back to the client, to the browser. So what happens after the server sends a response back to the browser? So after the server sends a response back to the browser, then browser will decide what to do. Like browser, let's say the server sends a success message back to the browser. Then on the browser, so the front end receives the response back from the server. Then this is the sample JavaScript code, because then again the JavaScript will work here. So what JavaScript will do here, let's say for example, you get a success message back from the server as a response back from the server. Now, what your browser will do is with the help of the JavaScript, it will redirect the user to your dashboard, right? Because everything, your username has been verified, your password has been verified, and both of the things are correct. And then Python has performed its job and everything. And you have got the response back from the server. And now everything is valid. So it will take you to your dashboard page. Basically, it will allow you to log into your whichever website you're logging into, maybe your Facebook or Gmail or banking application. It will allow you to log in, and it will take you to your personal dashboard where you will see your internal details after logging in. Or otherwise, if you get a if the your browser gets a failure message from the server, then it will show the relevant error message. It will be a meaningful error message which the user can understand, right? So these were the things which I wanted to show you, and you can see that this is how these things work together in this scenario. And if we go back here to this picture here, so these are pretty much the similar things are happening over here. So we had the front end, right? And then we had the browser, which we already understood, and what JavaScript does. We talked about that. Then comes the server, when a request is sent from the browser to the server. And then on the server, all the necessary logic that needs to be done, performed, is done by Python here. So to retrieve user credentials, to validate hashed password, check account status, whether it is an active account or whether it is a logged account. This also is checked by Python, or whether it is an invalid account, or maybe the account has been deleted or closed, right? All these things are checked by Python. Now, once it authenticates to, then it will generate an authentication token, right? Everything, all these things are done by Python. So here you can see that Python is connecting to the database, and then Python is sending the user authentication through SQL processing. So through SQL processing, then this is how it says, like, fetches user data and login history. So all the user data and login history is fetched from the database by using SQL. So the database will return the stored credentials and status. So whatever the credentials are stored in the database and the status of the user or the user account, all these things, database will return back to the SQL, right? And then the SQL will further send all these authentication results back to Python. So this is how it is connected to the database, and this is how the things are fetched from the database. And once we received the things back from the database, after this, the Python will make its decisions based on whatever business logic we are using here, right? So if the credentials are verified, then Python will also maintain a log. So a log is something where your transaction history, because like let's say a user is allowed to log in today, right? Like let's say you are using your personal banking website, and then today you are logging into your net banking account, and you put your correct username, your password, and everything, and then you click on the login button, and everything is verified, and it allows you to log into your banking website. But for this, a log is also maintained inside the database, inside the company's database. Inside that log, all the things are there, like your transaction history, your time, the time that the user tried to log into the account, and everything will be there for how much time the user was logged into the account, and when the account was logged out, right? Everything, all these minute details, all these things are maintained in a log inside the database, right? So this is what is meant by over here when it says Python logs login attempt, and it stores login attempt record to the database. So once everything is done, then the Python will close the database connection, because at this point of time, Python does not need any more information from database because everything has been done. So after this, Python will use the server, and the server will send the failure message or the success message back to the client, back to the browser. So after the browser, as we just talked about, that JavaScript will work. If it is a success message, then with the help of JavaScript, it will redirect you to dashboard, or it will show you the error message. It depends on what is happening, right? So I hope you understood how there are so many things that are happening when a user is trying to log into a website, and how all these things, what are these things, and how these individual things play their role in all this process. So I hope you understood all of that now, right? So basically, we also had another scenario which I can try to cover in quick short time. So another scenario here is I have is when a user. So basically, right now we have understood the main theoretical part of what HTML does, CSS does, and JavaScript does. But just in a different scenario, what these things will do, we are just going to discuss all that from this just one picture here, one diagram here. Now, let's say I have this website here. Now, this website is not a genuine website. It is, I mean, it is a genuine website, but it is not a real banking website. It is just a bank simulator. It is a dummy bank website which acts as it will show you the bank account for somebody, but it is not a real bank account. Now, let's say if I click get started now over here, right, it will just show you the UI in such a way that it looks like it's somebody's real bank account, and it's the real details, but all these details are not real, right? So now let's say on this UI, you are seeing all these menus here and all these options here. You are seeing the checking account and the saving account. But the scenario that we are going to discuss here is transferring the money. So when you click on transfer and when you go to make a transfer, right? So when you clicked on make a transfer here, these are the fields that came up, right? So now here you can select all these things, the payment frequency, whether you want to transfer money monthly or it's just one time, single time, right? And then here you can select the account from where you have to transfer the money, whether are you trying to transfer the money from your checking account or savings account. And transfer to, so let's say we select the transfer to is savings account here. So we are trying to transfer money from our checking to our savings account. And here is where we have to put how much amount we have to transfer and the payment date. This is where we have to mention that which on which payment day, which date you want to proceed with this payment. After that, we can like click on the button where with a make a transfer or something or submit button, right? So let's quickly see over here that in this scenario, what the user will do here, it will fill the transfer form, right? All these details will be filled by the user, and then user will hit the submit button or make a transfer button or whichever button is there on the website, right? After that, you already know all these things, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now let's see the JavaScript rules here. What will be the JavaScript rules over here? The JavaScript will make sure that the amount entered by the user is positive, right? For example, if over here we go and then if you try to transfer -$10, -$10 amount from your checking to savings, right? So the amount that you are trying to transfer from your one bank account to another bank account, it cannot be negative. So these are the validation points which JavaScript will check over here, right? So in such things, JavaScript will give you an error right away, right? It will check, it will validate selected accounts. It will validate that selected accounts are not the same. For example, if you go back here, and if you, let's say, if you are trying to transfer money from your checking account, and then accidentally, if here also, if you selected your checking account, then again you will get an error because both the accounts are the same, right? So JavaScript will check that both the accounts, the sender account and the receiving account, these accounts have to be different. If these accounts have been selected as the same accounts, then why would you transfer money from the same account to the same account? So it cannot happen. So this validation is also done by JavaScript over here, and it will prevent invalid payment dates. Like for example, if you try to select a date over here, which is a date from like last week or last month or last year, it is an invalid date. You cannot send or transfer money from a date which has already passed, right? So these are all the things that JavaScript will make sure that all these errors should not be there, right? So uh, after this, then again the request will be sent from the browser, the client or the browser to the server. And that's again where the Python will come into picture. So what Python will do here, it will check, it will validate the sender's balance, right? So here you can see that Python has connected to the database, then it will check sender's balance. So Python wants to check the sender's balance. Like who is the sender here? The sender here is the checking account, right? So Python wants to check the checking account balance here. So with SQL processing, the database will be connected, and then from the database we will do a query where we will ask the database to provide me the balance and the transaction history for that particular checking account of the user, right? And the database will return the balance details, right? You can see here the database will return the balance details. And once the SQL, through SQL processing, once we have the balance details, these details will be provided back to Python, right? So once Python has these details, the balance details, after that, it will validate the balance and the transaction feasibility. What it means here, the balance and transaction feasibility. Now, let's say now Python knows that how what's the balance in the checking account. Now Python knows at this point, right? Now let's say, let's consider here. So for example, this is the checking account, right? Now Python now knows from the database that your checking account has a balance of $216.04. But now what will happen if the user is trying to transfer $300 from the checking account to the savings account? Now Python will right away see that the balance of the checking account is less than the amount that the user is trying to transfer. So if you don't even have $300 balance in your checking account, then how can you transfer this amount to a different account? Because you don't have that balance available, right? So these are the kind of validations that Python will perform here. It will validate the balance and transaction feasibility, which means that it will verify that based on the balance, is the transaction possible or not? So these things Python will check here, right? So, but on the other side, if we put a reasonable or a valid amount, like let's say if we are trying to transfer just only $100 here from our checking account to savings account, then what will happen is then the Python will go and then it will deduct from sender and credits receiver. So then basically the same thing, everything will be updated in the database. It will update in the database. What will be updated? The user's checking accounts balance will be updated in the database. And instead of $216, it will be $116 left in the database after deducting $100. And the user's savings account, which is receiving the money of $100, that savings account will have a balance of $330 after receiving $100 from the checking. So Python will update the balance of the saving account as well in the database, right? So all this transaction will be logged into the database and everything will be stored and updated in the database. So once this has all these things are done, again Python will close the database connection. After closing the database connection, the server will send back either a transfer success message or a transfer failure message. It might send you just a message on the to the client saying that the transaction was successful, or it might say if there is any issue with the validation part of Python, it might say that the transaction did not go through due to insufficient balance in the checking account or anything. Like a meaningful message will be sent from Python by the use of server to the client, to the browser. And the same thing will be displayed on the browser, on the UI. And this message will be can be easily seen by the user. So this was another scenario. And as you can see, I think you might have a very good idea by now for the things, the JavaScript and how Python plays its role, how the database responds back to the requests, how the server is working, and how the server is accepting the requests, and how the server is sending back the response back to the client or the browser, right? So now I hope you understood what is the client side, what is the server side. So the front end, the UI, and the browser, whatever is happening in these two things here, that is basically your client side. And then whatever is happening when the request goes back to the server, from that point on to all the way to the database, all that is the server side, right? So these were the two sides of the web application which work in together in sync, right? So I hope you have a pretty good idea of what I meant to explain in this introduction to Python, the first tutorial video of our Python tutorial series. Obviously, I didn't want to directly jump into Python coding right away because I believe that this kind of information might be helpful to a lot of people uh, who are already working in Python, but they still might not know the general flow of these kind of scenarios, or these kind of how these applications work, and what are the things involved in an application, like the front end, back end. A lot of people are so confused when they have to answer all these things. But I hope you got a pretty good clarity, and uh, I hope this video was helpful for you, right? So I hope it gave you a clear understanding of how Python fits into a web application. Now, if you found this tutorial helpful, and if you want to support my work, then I also have my Ko-Fi page, which is, I believe, if I can open it, I can show you here. So this is my IP Tech Lab Ko-Fi page. Ko-Fi is a platform where you can actually support me if you like my content and if you like my tutorials, right? So this is all voluntary. I mean, if you want, if you like the content, you can decide to support me here. And also, I wanted to tell you that all these things, the documents, these diagrams, and all this personal things that I prepared for my Python tutorial series, I will be sharing these things with you on the Ko-Fi platform. But what you need to do is you can choose to get my membership. So this is my membership page. If you go and click on my membership, so you can get my monthly membership, and for all my members, all these details and the documents or resources and notes from each tutorial that I will post on YouTube, you can get all these things for free after joining my membership, right? Um, so this is one option, but for those people who might not want to enroll in my monthly membership, I for those I also have a shop, Ko-Fi shop. So you can go to my Ko-Fi shop here. Basically, if you don't want to get a monthly membership, and if you don't want to access all the materials for free after the membership, you can decide to personally purchase any of the specific tutorial documents from here, whichever you want or whichever you like. So for non-members, it will be a certain price for all those things here on my Ko-Fi page. But for members, it will be free, as you can see here, right? So I just wanted to thank you all, and your support helps me create more in-depth and high-quality content, and I truly appreciate every bit of it. So make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on upcoming tutorials, because I will be coming up with the upcoming Python tutorials here in 2025 pretty soon. And we will go with the installation of Python and the installation of the IDE, the integrated development environment. And also, we are going to discuss some Python features, and from there, we will go more into the details of the things in Python, right? So let's keep learning together, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.